Mary Tamm, Second Generation, The Autobiography, Volume 2. Read by the Timekeys, Ramona. Chapter 11. New York, New York. I had always dreamed of visiting New York, and now the opportunity had arrived. I was invited to a science fiction convention in that city, where the guests were not only from Doctor Who, but other sci-fi programs and films. I was the sole guest from Who, though, and flew out to the States alone this time. The city was everything I had expected, and more. The taxi ride from the airport to the hotel was thrilling enough, what with the snaking lines of traffic everywhere, busily tooting and light flashing as we crossed the huge bridge into Manhattan, where I was to stay. Once in the thick of the melee of cars, yellow cabs, and pedestrians, I felt as though I was on a movie set. The noise and energy of the place was simply electrifying. I loved it. I arrived at the hotel as dusk was falling, and stared upwards into the crowded street to see the darkening sky just visible over the tallest buildings I had ever seen. Had I not been so tired from the journey, I would have attempted to walk around for a while, but I wisely decided it was too late now anyway, so reluctantly entered the hotel to check in. Adam Malin, who was organizing the con, had left a message for me to call him and let him know I had arrived safely, which I duly did. I then took the elevator up to a floor number so dizzyingly high I worried about possible altitude sickness. I opened the door to my hotel room, a massive chamber covering the ground space of 2 British terraced houses, and walked to the giant floor-to-ceiling windows to behold the most incredible sight. The shiny black skyscrapers of Manhattan, with their brightly gleaming windows, stretching upwards and outwards as far as the eye could see. They glittered like stately giant candles, massed together in silent grandeur. I was so mesmerized by their beauty, I gazed at them in excited awe for hours, quite unable to sleep, reflecting on the many films I had seen which had featured these amazing edifices, now here before my eyes, and even more incredible to behold in solid reality. Jet lag has never really been a problem for me, luckily, as I tend to stick with UK time on short trips, as this one was, just 4 days. So I was up at the crack of dawn, New York time, ready to face the day. I hit the hotel pool just as the cleaners were leaving, swam a few quick lengths, and then ordered a sumptuous breakfast. The full English we enjoy in the UK is done slightly differently in America. The bacon is thinner, crispier, and smokier, and the eggs are accompanied by fried potatoes and sometimes, especially in the South, grits, a strangely tasteless concoction reminiscent of porridge. Whatever, I wolfed it all down and prepared to do some sightseeing. Many friends had warned me of the dangers of walking the streets of New York alone. Muggings were a huge danger here at this particular time in the 80s, and still a relatively unknown concept back in Blighty. It seems ironic now that I had even the slightest trepidation about it, when our knife crime figures are soaring here in the UK at the time of writing this, 2010, and with London being one of the most violent places on the planet. Any small fears I had then were unjustified, however, as the New Yorkers were all extremely friendly and helpful, pointing out directions to me with great enthusiasm and suggesting places I could visit, all the while wishing me a nice day. It was all very welcoming and warmed me to the city even more. So far so good. I wandered down Broadway and gazed at the billboards outside the theaters, wishing I could afford the ticket prices, which were astronomical, at least 4 or even 5 times higher than those on Shaftesbury Avenue. No chance of the underprivileged enjoying theater here, I thought. A tiny boutique appeared, wedged in among the theater buildings, and I impulsively popped in to discover the most amazing array of flamboyant clothes. I spotted a snazzy white jumpsuit, rather reminiscent of my first Ramona costume. Well, it was white anyway, which I promptly tried on. It was a perfect fit. I had to have it, and incredibly cheap too. I wore it that weekend at the con, and it was a huge hit. Remarkably, it is one of the few 80s outfits I have not flogged on eBay, and it still hangs in my wardrobe to this day. Soon I reached Fifth Avenue and spent the rest of the morning wandering round the stores, which were mind-blowing opulent to say the least, especially the famous Saks, where I purchased a modest bargain or two. At midday, my stomach, still on English time, told me it was starving, so I found a small hamburger joint, again so familiar in style from all the films I had seen, booths with chucked tablecloths, a jukebox, wooden floors, etc. I plonked myself at the counter and noticed bowls of cole-slaw dotted along the shiny chrome surface. Yippee! No need to order, the starters were right there. I was just demolishing the second one when the waiter shouted, "Hey lady, leave some for the other customers, will ya?" I was not at all mortified at being ticked off. So authentically Bronx was the guy's accent and vernacular, not at all that odd, considering that was probably where he was from. It merely tickled me to hear it, and reinforced the realization that I was not in a dream. Another customer kindly explained to me that the bowl's contents were like relish, and were to be used sparingly. I replied that the coleslaw here was quite different from the sort we had in Britain, which was mushy and vinegary. Here it was creamy, crispy, and obviously freshly made, so absolutely delicious, hence my greed. Eventually, other folks started chatting to me when they noticed my English accent, and then the chef came out from the kitchen, which was only a couple of steps from the bar where we were sitting, and presented me with a great bowl of the stuff, all to myself, having obviously overheard the conversation. I thanked him profusely and guzzled it happily with the giant-sized burger and chips, all exquisitely cooked and so tasty. McDonald's would never really cut it for me again. I waved goodbye to one and all, stuffed to the gills, and rolled down the road to the port this time, where I joined a throng of tourists queuing to board a huge boat that took us on an hour-long trip round Manhattan Island. We passed the famous Bronx area and Harlem, and then the Place de Resistance, the glorious Statue of Liberty, hove into view. Nothing I'd ever seen, in magazines or in the movies, had prepared me for her grandeur and size. What a beauty! She towered above the ship, dwarfing it completely, so that we mere mortals below could only stand agape and marvel at her. It was not just the physical presence of the statue that was so impressive, but also what it symbolized, namely the various statues of democracy which most of us are so familiar with, liberty, justice, and freedom for all, etc. Such lofty sentiments. I could not help but reflect on all the many thousands of immigrants who had traveled to America to make a new life, and been greeted on their arrival by this gracious lady. She was awesome. Again, I wondered how different my life would have been had my parents, escaping as refugees, caught the boat from Estonia, which would have taken them to these shores. I felt quite a pang to think that I could have legitimately belonged to this magnificent city. I wandered back to the hotel, taking in the Museum of Modern Art on the way. It was a revelation to see many of the paintings I had studied for A-level art here in the flesh, so to speak. The difference between the flat illustrations of Gombrig's History of Art, the definitive Bible for art students everywhere, and the reality of the actual pictures was fascinating. I had never imagined that they would be so vibrant and three-dimensional, with every paint stroke visible to the naked eye in rich, fresh color. They looked as though they had been painted yesterday. I was delighted and gazed at them for hours. And so to work. The convention began the next morning, and I was met at my hotel room door by a very tall, muscular, and handsome black guy who introduced himself as my bodyguard for the weekend. I was flabbergasted, but then remembered my experience in Chicago, where I had been nearly mobbed by screaming fans, and followed him without demur. He was, it turned out, an ex-US Marine, which was even more mind-boggling for me, especially when he had escorted me to the door of the Louvre later, where frantic fans slipped their autograph books under the cubicle for me to sign. I had to politely decline and ask them to wait in line later. I felt awful refusing them, but had been instructed by Adam to do so. It was surreal, to say the least. The Dalis in the art museum were only slightly more so, but I suppose a line had to be drawn somewhere, and the Louvre door seemed to be it. The madness continued, with queues of hundreds of people filling the hotel corridors, often continuing for 4 hours at a time. Luckily, my name is quite short, so I can sign an autograph very quickly, but my hand was quite sore afterwards. I felt sorry for some of the other guests, who were at the tables next to me, with many more letters in their names to scribble each time. Another feature of this amazing convention was the fans who had dressed up as their favorite characters from shows and movies such as Battlestar Galactica, Buck Rogers, The Martian Chronicles, Star Wars, Blake 7, Flash Gordon, and Star Trek: The Next Generation. I had seen my own costume featured prolifically in Chicago, of course, but now was assailed by the sight of hordes of unfamiliar, weird beings from extraterrestrials to monsters, who were all slightly entertaining to watch, especially as the hours in the hot, airless signing room wore on. Being a sci-fi virgin of sorts, I had only really had a passing interest in Marvel Comics ages ago. It was all a new and illuminating experience. I had seen Star Wars, though, and recognized Darth Vader and C-3PO, and was especially gratified to meet the actors who played them, namely David Prowse and Anthony Daniels, respectively, but that was about it. I had never watched any other sci-fi films or programs, so consequently did not recognize any of my fellow guests, apart from the aforementioned two, and even then, only in their costumes. The new revelation for me here were the Trekkies, many of whom adorned themselves with the false ears that Mr. Spock sported, and who became a very familiar sight at future gatherings. I learned a great deal about the phenomenon that is the Sci-Fi convention by chatting to the fans who had so patiently queued up to meet me. They informed me of their main objective in attending, which was, of course, meeting and getting the signatures of their favorite screen characters, but also the chance to meet other fans, socialize, buy merchandise from the dealers' rooms, including books, photos, posters, action figures, prop replicas, and t-shirts, and to visit video rooms in which well-loved episodes of favorite TV programs were aired continuously. Nowadays, incredibly, there are conventions held at locations around the world every week of the year, but back then I was so new to the whole con circuit that I was in constant state of bemusement. I'm an old hand at it now, of course. On the first evening, it was still light outside, and I walked up to Times Square, rubbernecking the towering advertising billboards. I noticed the horse-drawn carriages there, alongside Central Park, waiting for the last tourist customers of the day. I impulsively hired one, feeling a bit of a fool, as I noticed that other carriages passing me were filled with canoodling couples, but I need not have worried. Again, the New Yorkers were very friendly, and passers-by waved at me, all the while wishing me a nice evening, and yelling, "Having fun there, lady?" but in a sincere tone. I could not imagine the reserved Brits calling out in this way, or, if they were to, it would be sadly sneeringly. Consequently, I did not feel at all left out among the romantic twosomes, but thoroughly enjoyed my ride round the park as the evening slowly descended. The glittering skyscrapers dominated the sky once again, and I relished the ambience of what was a magical experience. I could not help but cast my mind back to a New Year's Eve party I had attended when I was single, when, at the stroke of midnight, I was left alone with only the host's dog for company, as everyone paired off to kiss their partners, and I realized, with a pang of acute embarrassment, that I was the only single present. Well, I certainly suffered no such discomfiture here now, just a deep contentment and a sense of belonging. My first trip to New York had surpassed all my highest expectations, with other subsequent trips, though exciting, never really lived up to. It remains, however, and to this day, my favorite city in the whole wide world. Simply sublime.